Welcome, everyone. I am Mark Mogle, Assistant Director for Forensics at the Department of Justice's International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program, also known as ICITAP. I would like to thank everyone for the exceptional response to this event. While I don't have the final numbers on participants yet, I can say that we have people registered from every continent except Antarctica. While everyone might not be able to watch this event live, it is great to see the international forensic community coming together for this virtual event. For those not familiar with ICITAP, we work closely with the U.S. Department of State, supporting foreign governments to develop professional and transparent law enforcement institutions that protect human rights, combat corruption, and reduce the threat of transnational crime and terrorism. We believe that forensic laboratories are a critical and necessary part of a criminal justice system that effectively serves its citizens by providing reliable and unbiased results in a timely manner. One way ICITAP supports this is by helping partner laboratories achieve international accreditation through the implementation of quality management systems. To date, ICITAP has assisted laboratories in at least 14 countries achieve international accreditation. An important role of management is strategic planning. The inspiration for this webinar came from our colleagues in Costa Rica who are working on a 5 to 10-year strategic plan and asked for some assistance. A key question needed to be answered to help inform this plan is, where is the field of forensic science going? To help answer this question, ICITAP turned to our colleagues from the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, also known as ASCLD. ASCLD has been a strong partner for ICITAP over the years, and together we developed the idea to gather some of the thought leaders in their respective disciplines. We also noted that many labs, including those in the United States, could benefit from this discussion, which led us to today's webinar. I hope you find the discussion worthwhile. Thank you for sharing your time with us, whether it's morning or night where you are. Thank you, and I'll now turn it over to Tony, Chair of ASCLD's International Committee. Tony?
Thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to Future Directions in Forensic Science. My name is Tony Tessarolo, and I'm the Director of the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, Canada. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the American Society of Crime Lab Directors. On behalf of ASCLD, I'd like to thank ICITAP and Mark Mogle in particular for their assistance in organizing this event, and to all of you for joining us. Forensic science is ever-changing. Changes often occur as a result of technological advancements, like the development of new or improved instrumentation. Sometimes the change is the result of processes that have been altered or refined to generate results that are more specific or more sensitive or more efficient. And sometimes forensic science changes in response to negative events, criticism, or other opportunities for improvement that are identified in the course of doing the work that we do. So with all this change, it can be quite daunting for forensic labs with limited budgets and resources to make the right choices for today and for the future. And that's why we're bringing this webinar to you today. I'd like to thank Mauricio Chacon of the Costa Rican Forensic Laboratory for raising this topic and inspiring the content of today's presentation. Over the next 2 hours, we'll look closely at what the future might hold in 3 key forensic disciplines. And we hope that this information and the perspectives of our eminent speakers might help you with your own planning as you think about the direction that you and your lab or institution needs to take to prepare itself for the future. So our format for today will be that we have 3 presenters, and I'll introduce them to you shortly, each delivering a presentation of about 30 minutes in length. Following the 3 presentations, we'll move to a Q&A session to fill the remaining time in our 2-hour slot. We invite you to ask questions of our presenters through the Q&A window on your screen. Feel free to use the chat window for the interaction amongst each other, but please put all of your questions in the Q&A window. It'll only be in that window that we're going to be identifying questions for our presenters. The event is being recorded, so for on-demand viewing later. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you our three speakers for today. First is Bruce Houlihan. Bruce is the director of the Orange County Crime Laboratory in Southern California, a position he's held since 2010. He's worked at the OCCL for almost 34 years, dedicating most of his professional career to forensic science in Orange County, as well as national initiatives and organizations. His early work at the OCCL included toxicology and controlled substances, substance analyses, as well as method development and advancements in information processing within forensic science. Bruce moved into leadership with OCCL in the early 90s and has served at both supervisor and manager levels. Mr. Houlihan serves on the American Society of Crime Laboratory Governing Board and also served as the chair of the Opioid and Emerging Drugs Task Force Committee. He is currently serving a 6-year term with the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, Quality Infrastructure Committee, a national organization with mission to improve forensic science in the United States. Our second speaker is Tim Kupferschmid. Tim Kupferschmid has 30 years of executive management and forensic DNA testing experience. Mr. Kupferschmid holds 2 master's degrees, one in forensic science and the other is an MBA. Tim has worked as a senior DNA analyst at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, served as the laboratory director of the Maine State Police Crime Lab, and was the forensic technical director at Myriad Genetic Laboratories. Tim was the scientific founder of Sorensen Forensics in 2006. And in 2013, he moved to the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner, where he leads its 4 laboratories: forensic biology, forensic toxicology, molecular genetics, and histology. Currently, Tim serves on the board of directors of the American Society of Crime Lab Directors and is chairman of the North Carolina Forensic Science Advisory Board. And our third speaker is Erich Smith. Erich D. Smith has been with the FBI Laboratory Forensic Firearms Tool Marks Unit since 1998 and has been a qualified examiner since 2002. Prior to joining the FBI, he worked with the Virginia Division of Forensic Sciences in their FTU. He has a master's degree in forensic science from Virginia Commonwealth University and is a regular member of the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners. Mr. Smith functions as technical leader for the Firearms Tool Marks discipline for the FBI Laboratory and serves on the OSAC Physics Pattern Interpretation Subcommittee for Firearms and Tool Marks. While a member of OSAC, Mr. Smith has authored the standard or the implementation of 3D technology in forensic science laboratories. So 3 great speakers, and I look very as forward as you to listening to them today. So we'll turn it over to our first speaker, Bruce Houlihan. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. Thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time today to talk about some of the directions in forensic chemistry. I'm talking to you from Southern California, so I'll say good morning, but I know we're in many different time zones across the world, which is just wonderful. It's very early for me, but it's good to be with you first thing part of the day for me, but also to talk about where we're actually going in toxicology and seized drugs. I'm going to include a lot of slides with information that I won't be talking about because you're going to have the slides available to you for reference. So I want to give you more information that you can review later. So I'm going to cover the slides at a very 30,000-foot level, but you're welcome to actually email me. My contact information is actually in the slides, and my email and phone number here anytime you like if you have any questions about what I'm going to be presenting. Most of the information I'm going to be talking about is gleaned from conversations with my colleagues across the country and some of the trends that we actually see in both toxicology and seized drugs. To give you a real quick overview, we're seeing a transition from GC to LC a lot in the industry. I think there's a better acceptance of broad technology, not necessarily focusing on 1 or 2 types of technology, but budgeting of the equipment that we have to work with is a big deal because some of this equipment is very expensive. There's a very significant push, I think, or at least a need to push into automated data systems. We're dealing with very high volumes of information now, and so having computerized systems that can process the data is very important. We have a lot of methods, obviously, to validate. The LIMS systems that are going to be working with these instruments and interfacing with these instruments is important. And as Tony actually mentioned, there's a constant change in forensic science, specifically about our standards, best practices, rapid implementation of different technologies, and OSAC is a really good example of this. So these are some of the areas I'm actually going to be covering in the next few slides. Obviously, fentanyl and opioids have changed a lot about what we do. Here in Southern California, we're dealing with a dramatic increase in discoveries and legal requirements for documentation, and that requires all of our instrumental printouts, the information that we generate, like chromatograms, electropherograms, and so forth. The number of drugs that we're required to analyze includes bath salts, synthetic cannabinoids, the analogs to the fentanyls. The number of prescription drugs that we actually see in driving cases increased. And of course, we're dealing with some very significant safety issues across this country, particularly because of the fentanyls and carfentanil. And so naloxone and handheld screening devices are also a big deal. I'll conclude a little bit talking about helium to hydrogen conversion. I won't go through all these definitions, but just for the reference in the slides themselves, these are some of the terms I'm going to be using. When I talk about LCMS, I generally mean a triple quad, high-res mass spectroscopy. I'm usually going to use QTOF to refer to it, but it can be any kind of high-res mass specs. And I'll talk about a protein crash as a simplified extraction. But generally, these are some of the terms I'm going to be using. So one of the advantages a lot of crime laboratories actually have is the ability to actually mix and synthesize some of the information that we're gleaning from three specific areas. Seized drugs are solid samples, powders, tars, so forth. Driving toxicology has been a huge increase of interest especially here in the United States, but across the world. And of course, postmortem toxicology, which has been around a long time. But being able to integrate the information that we're gleaning from all three of these different areas has given us some unique skill sets and allows us to be a little bit more prescient about what's coming up in the future, and so how to prepare for this. So what we see being submitted as powders, tars, and soap pills, whatever, on the street is eventually going to be in individuals that are actually driving, and of course, actually going to be affecting causes of death in postmortem toxicology. And so if you have the ability to work with your colleagues, or if you're fortunate to be in a laboratory that does all three of these, integrating the information that you're actually seeing in all three of these areas can actually help you dramatically decide what kind of methodologies, what you need to prepare for, and so forth. A lot of this has to do with the geographic issues that are going on as well. In the East Coast, they saw the increase in fentanyl a lot more than we saw it here on the West Coast. Unfortunately, I don't know what's going on with the rest of the world in terms of the increase in fentanyl, but in terms of geographic increases, but it is a big issue, of course, worldwide. We also have to make decisions about what drugs are going to be tested. A lot of this depends on what you're seeing on the streets, what's actually being submitted to the laboratories, but additionally, what your instruments are able to analyze. There are a lot of new regulations about what's controlled and what isn't. New standards being developed, how the methods are actually developed. So obviously we have a lot of input and requirements for how we're going to be doing our jobs in the future, whether it's legal or whether it's a requirement of our clients. The world is a lot smaller than it actually used to be. Fortunately, we were able to communicate with each other a lot better, and what you're actually doing here, what we're doing there. And so that communication is critical because things simply are changing so quickly. One of the biggest advantages, of course, is that we have shared literature. So starting with toxicology, and I'll get to seized drugs a little bit later, but one of the trends we've actually noticed is that our caseload is going up, and this is no surprise to you, I'm sure. Our staff has been dwindling. We've had a lot of retirements here, but we don't have the time. Obviously, COVID is affecting what we're doing. Solvents and the use of traditional extractions are changing greatly because we were trying to reduce the number of chlorinated solvents, of course, that we actually use. And then everybody wants things faster. I don't know in other countries if you noticed the push for quantitations as much. So developing levels, not just in postmortem toxicology, but in driving cases, is also something that our clients are asking for. So how we do this is critical. Alcohol, of course, is not going away, and so we're all continually going to be dealing with DUI cases. DUI drugs, of course, is increasing. But the use of mass spectroscopy in alcohol analysis is becoming more of a standard. But a lot more of the felony DUIs are requiring looks at prescription drugs, mood-altering drugs, psychotics, THC, and we'll talk about polydrugs in just a minute. So quantitation is one of those things that I think it's a good idea for us to prepare for, because it's going to be across the board, including even in these drugs. The number of analogs that we're actually seeing in fentanyl, the number of opioids we're seeing, and of course there are a lot of other drug classes that are actually a big part of what we're doing. But all of this is driving now just as much as it was postmortem toxicology. The number of drugs that we looked at in postmortem was always bigger than DUID, or driving under the influence of drugs. But now I think we're actually doing just as many with drug driving as we are with postmortem. As I mentioned, the East Coast is actually dealing with the fentanyls a lot more than we have been on the West Coast, so it's really been moving west. But your jurisdictions may have different drugs that are more prevalent, but I bet that you're dealing with a broader class call than you've had in the past. So the number of drugs, the number of methods, the number of classes that we have to deal with are becoming a bigger challenge for us. Here in Orange County, we have a much larger increase in THC in driving, as you can see. A lot of our samples that come in on driving, 62% in this case, have no drugs, but we're dealing with 40% of our driving samples have some form of drug in them. A lot of it's THC, but it's benzos and other drugs as well. So dealing with multiple drugs and classes in our driving cases is significant. One of the things that's a little bit more scary, if you look at the opioids that we're actually getting here in Orange County, is the number of fentanyls that we're actually seeing in driving cases. That's the yellow bar in this graph over the last 10 years. But the number of opioids that we're actually seeing, and a large number of opioids. It's no longer just morphine and codeine and 6-monoacetylmorphine. It's actually dealing with other analogs as well. It's not just the number that we're seeing, but the kind that we're actually seeing. Particularly of concern is the amount of fentanyl that we're actually seeing in drivers. This has been going up over the last 3 years. A lot of this are people that have probably developed a tolerance for the compound, but this is increasing as well. As it is in postmortem cases. You can see with the blue bars that are driving under the influence with fentanyl has been increasing, as I showed in the other slides too, but postmortem is no different, a very significant increase. And this is not just the parent fentanyl, this is actually analogs. This is just one particular case, one particular driving case that we actually had here. I'm showing it just to indicate the number of different drugs that you can see. So polydrug cases, being able to see more than one drug in your analyses has now become critical. So things are moving from serial analyses to parallel analyses. That's important. Now, obviously, some of these are metabolites, but this is not that unusual in terms of the casework that we see. So the methodologies that we're using to be able to analyze multiple drugs at the same time is just as important. So some of the transitions we've gone through when you're dealing with less use of solvents, less staff, shorter extractions, quicker delivery times, and more across-the-board quantitations are handled really with some instrumentation changes and methodology changes. So one of those is changing from GC to LC. So if I had to talk about my personal preference, is to have as many different methodologies as you can online, because they all have different skill sets. But in general, we found that LCMS and high-resolution mass spectroscopy tends to be the trend to try to address some of these challenges that we have. It does require some really good method development staff, so you need dedicated staff for this. The instruments are a lot more costly up front, but you do have a lot of savings down the road, particularly in terms of your extraction, staff time, automation, and so forth. Because you're looking at a lot more drugs, there's a significant increase in data processing. not just data you're receiving, data you actually have to go through. Your instrumentations are more complex, so the contracts or the service contracts are going to be a lot more expensive, so you really need to budget those up front. And of course, your testimonies and your reports, the information that you're delivering to your clients is going to be more challenging as well. So there are still advantages and disadvantages to both LC and GC, and a lot of you that are in toxicology, I'm sure, are very familiar with this. So again, I would typically advocate for the broadest range of instrumentation that you can provide or allow in your laboratory. But in terms of liquid chromatography, you have the ability to look for more drugs at the same time, a lot better parallel processing. LC gives you a lot more opportunities in terms of your chromatographic system. You can look for acids, bases, neutrals. You're not dealing with thermally labile compounds as much, or at least the risks of dealing with high temperature GC that you do with LC. You can still derivatize if you want. I think chiral analysis is a little bit easier. Because of some of the advances in the LC triple quad technology, your extractions or protein crashes can be a lot simpler than dealing with traditional liquid-liquid extractions. And dealing with more complicated matrices is a little bit easier with LC. But GCMS is still very good for target analysis. It's still a lot cheaper. We still have multiple detectors like NPDs that we can actually use. It's very good for target analyses. And generally, you can get a good GCMS system for less than $100,000. But on an LC system, you're actually dealing with something that starts around $300,000 to $400,000. So LCs, while they're a little bit more, well, a lot more expensive up front, they do have a lot more advantages and cost savings down the road, but GCMS is much easier to get started with a lower cost. We are seeing a lot more higher molecular weight molecules. I'll talk briefly about biochemical molecules a little bit later towards the end, but biochemical drugs are increasing, I think, a little bit. But you have, again, a lot more options with LC in your mobile phases, how you do extractions, whether you want to do reverse phase or normal phase, and the type of columns that you actually use. So LC and especially LC triple quads are becoming a greater trend. One of the advantages that high-res gives you is the ability to have a really large set of drugs that you're actually targeting and then narrow it down to identify and actually quantitate if you want to. We do all of our quantitations by LC triple quad, and our QTOF is actually used for targeted screening, but the QTOF has a much broader set of drugs that it can actually look for. But again, you have a much broader set of classes of drugs that are able. So on the left is really our traditional methods where everything's very serial. We would screen with immunoassays, and we would go to targeted analyses for a particular and a very small drug class, but we do things serially as we needed to look for different drug classes. But as we move to LC triple quads and the QTOF systems, we're actually able to do things a lot more in parallel. So we still have GCMSs, and they're good for really specific analyses and specific destinations that we want. But again, triple quads and QTOFs give us a very broad screening, and things can actually be done in parallel very, very quickly. I mentioned briefly that a lot of laboratories are actually moving to mass specs in their headspace analyses with volatiles. And this gives you a broader set of volatiles that you can actually look for, in addition to quantitations. And just having a mass spec available to you gives you a little bit more confidence in the results. So I think the trend is actually by GCMSs now with volatile analysis in toxicology. Our screening is still done by robotics. Robotics, of course, can help you with automating a lot of your target and screening. If you have particular classes like drugs of abuse, they're still very good for that. Just to give you some reference, this is what the number of drugs that we can actually see in our current LC triple quad methods. But when we're dealing with QTOF, we have a lot more drugs that we can actually screen for. So the QTOF is very good for screening, and then if we do quantitations, we'll actually move to an LC triple quad. All of these are targeted, though. We're not actually doing scanning or we're doing target modes on our QTOF. Real quick, the LC systems, though, are very expensive up front. You're dealing with $300,000 to $400,000 at the get-go, where you're dealing generally with about $100,000 on a GCMS. You will have more GCMSs to do the same work that you may have with an LC triple quad or a QTOF. So they're trade-offs, but I think that even though you need greater method development, greater time with the LCs, they still have distinct advantages in the long term. But I would argue, again, for having both systems if you can. I would also recommend, and I think the trend is actually to deal with quantitations, not just in postmortem toxicology, but in driving cases as well. It helps you with matrix differences. Our clients actually want to know how much in the driving cases. Replicates, of course, give you better precision. So if you can afford it and you can handle doing duplicate analyses in your methods, I think there are distinct advantages to this, and I would recommend in the future as an option for you to consider. Also, everything that we have now is obviously discoverable, but when I say everything, I mean the chromatograms, I mean the run sheets. And so given the volume of information that you're dealing with the QTOFs and the triple quads, automating your systems so that the instruments can talk to your LIMS system to provide this is important. Getting this information to the attorneys in discovery is also critical, and doing it in an automated fashion so that your staff actually don't have to do it manually. It can be done automated on websites, can save you a tremendous amount of time. And I also mentioned how liquid-liquid extractions are being simplified, and the number or the amount of solvents that we're actually using are greatly reduced. Protein crashes can help us with LC, but solid phase extraction and prep columns are actually helping as well. We've been doing quantitations and postmortem work for quite a while, but I think there's a greater call for different matrices than there used to be. Traditionally, it was just blood and maybe a few, like brain or liver occasionally, but it seems like we're doing these matrices a lot more, in addition to a broader set of analyses, a broader set of classes of drugs, but we're doing vitreous, femoral blood, and other tissues a lot more too. And there's a lot more unknowns in our cases. We've been looking at doing metal analysis. Some of you are probably doing that as well, but having everything from ICP-MS all the way down to regular GCMSs is a big advantage as well. And of course, THC, which is a big deal here in the United States, but driving into the influence and the prevalence of use of marijuana, as well as the other cannabinoids, is a big issue too. In our DUID requests, the other classes that we actually see are shown here. THC and alcohol driving is probably the biggest, but we do see benzodiazepines and a lot of them, a lot of different kinds, as well as the Z drugs like zolpidem, polydrug cases, and we're seeing a lot of different analogs with fentanyl as well. So the ability to analyze these and have the instrumentation to do this can really add some significant advantages to your clients. This is a quick slide from NIFLS showing some of the seized drugs, moving down to seized drugs that are in this United States. So you can see in the fentanyl area here, there's a lot more of these analogs. And particularly concerning to me is carfentanil. We had our first 400 gram, not our first carfentanil, but first large carfentanil case, which is about 400 grams here in Southern California. And obviously carfentanil is extremely lethal. So the prevalence of carfentanil is a big deal. But fentanyls are increasing across this country as well, and particularly in these drugs areas. These are just some examples of the fentanyl that we see. Very large quantities is mixed with propofol. We see a lot in our pills. Sorry for the animation there. A lot of this comes as packaging like Xanax, but it's typically fentanyl. And while the other drugs that we're actually seeing in our seized drugs area are relatively constant, though they're generally increasing a little bit, you see alprazolam here in the green line, we've seen a marked increase in fentanyl here. And here in Southern California, this is nothing compared to what the East Coast of the United States is actually seeing. Our kilos have actually increased with fentanyl as well. But of course, meth is still our greatest submission. And you can see the combinations that we have with fentanyl, as well as with some of the opioids. This is a slide from Linda Jackson, who's laboratory director in Virginia. We have a hemp bill here in the United States, which legalizes a little bit or relaxes the regulations on the use of hemp. But of course, because of the overlap of THC, that it forces laboratories in some states to quantitate the THC levels that they actually have in a sample. And if it's generally 3% or higher, it's a lot of states it's illegal. Below 3% is actually classified as hemp. So the difficulty for laboratories is actually being required to quantitate the THC where we weren't prepared to do that. So seized drugs traditionally doesn't do a lot of quantitations, but trending your methods to actually quantitate the drugs if you can is a strong recommendation. So standards, of course, in OSAC are increasing the quantitations. I think in seized drugs, the number of different methods that you have available, just like you do in toxicology, so the diversity of methods is a strong advantage. But adapting to the new analogs, those of you who've worked in seized drugs know the number of synthetics that we have with bath salts, synthetic cannabinoids, and the fentanyls. We see fentanyl analogs new every day, so listening to the news group. So being prepared for those analogs as they're coming out is a big deal. And communication actually help with that a lot. The manufacturing of these drugs is getting more sophisticated and quicker, and keeping up with that is a challenge for us, particularly because of carfentanil, but also the fentanyls. A naloxone program in your laboratory is critical, not just for your field staff, but also for your drug staff, even people that are actually fingerprinting drugs. Make sure they have naloxone available to them, multiple doses, in case they come in contact with a powder or some kind of material like fentanyl that could compromise their health. Biochemical drugs are just beginning. We see this with steroids, GHB, and others, but I think this is going to be a growing area, one of the reasons why LC will help us a lot. And some of the laboratories, particularly the DEA, are using direct analysis, which allows you to take a sample and just hold it up in front of the instrument and actually get a sampling of the powders coming off or the vapor that's coming off from that sample, and do a direct analysis real time. A little dirty, but it can be an advantage for you for quick analysis. And there's a greater use of field testing devices that the field staff and the investigators can actually use to see what do we have here without actually opening up the packaging. Mixed results, I think, from a lot of laboratories in terms of the number of different samples that you can actually use in field testing. So you have to worry about how transparent your packaging is. Obviously, you don't want to open a fentanyl powder unless you have to. So testing these devices, they're usually handheld Raman or IR, but testing these devices, I think, is prudent before you actually start using them. When you're developing your methods, as I begin to wrap this up here, when you're developing your methods, make sure that you plan for automated systems to get the information out of the instruments into your lens system or into your reporting system. Just the sheer volume of data, particularly with the high-res mass specs where you're actually using multiple drugs, getting it out into your lens system to prepare the reports is critical, so your staff actually don't have to be doing this. So automated systems are important. Finally, there's a worldwide helium shortage, and it waxes and wanes a little bit. Some people feel that this is because of just a supply chain issue. Some people think that the actual supplies we get are dwindling. But I think it's a good idea to think about using hydrogen-based chromatography systems, particularly with GC, when you're buying new ones. I don't like hydrogen tanks in our laboratory, obviously for safety reasons. Obviously, you have to be careful of hydrogen, but hydrogen generators are a good thing. Hydrogen generally is a better carrier, but we've noticed some reduction in sensitivity, and you also have to be careful in GC systems about hydrogenating your double bonds and so forth when you use hydrogen. So there are limitations, and of course, safety is one of them. So I'm going to include some slides from some of the OSAC standards. This is provided by Dan Anderson in Colorado, just for your reference. I'm not going to talk about them here, but some of the trends that we're actually going through. So these are some of the questions. Maybe we can talk about these at the end, questions that you've submitted. So I'm going to turn it over to our host, and I want to thank you for giving me your time. And if we have time, we can talk about your questions.
Thanks very much, Bruce. If you do have questions, those of you in the audience, please make sure you use the Q&A section to provide questions that we'll take at the end. So we'll move on to our second speaker, Tim Kupferschmid, and I'll turn the mic over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you, Bruce. Let me put my screen together. Can everybody see that okay, I assume? So I have well, first of all, let me say I'm honored to be here and to speak with you today about some potential future directions in forensic DNA analysis. I have 4 very large topics that were requested of me. Each of these topics could be easily a talk on its own, but I'm going to briefly touch on the use of genetic genealogy, the use of rapid DNA on criminal evidence, the use of next generation sequencing for criminal cases, and finally the use of probabilistic genotyping. And again, I hope to talk a little bit about some potential future directions in each of these areas. Forensic genetic genealogy uses direct-to-consumer DNA databases in combination with public records to build family trees to identify missing persons or to develop suspects. Hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, sometimes up to 1 million, are sequenced across the genome and compared to similar SNPs in commercial DNA ancestry databases. And this is done in order to determine the level and type of genetic relationship between individuals. Public databases populated with ancestry hobbyists are searched to develop familial relationships, looking for demographic identifiers like age, gender, and place of residence. Genealogical analysis reveals potential relatives out to 3rd or 4th cousins. In that case, a 4th cousin would share a great-great-great-grandparent. Genealogists then build family trees backwards and then forwards to potential persons of interest. Some very well-known cases that I'm sure most of you are aware of. The 2 on the left and right sides of the slide are before the recent or more modern genetic genealogy. Richard III's grave was discovered in 2012. He was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. However, about 50 years later, his tomb was lost. The year was 1538, when the friary where he was entombed was destroyed. So traditional DNA testing, mitochondrial DNA and YSTRs, was used to reconstruct his family tree and to positively identify him. On the right-hand side, Sally Hemings, who lived between 1773 and 1835, was an enslaved woman of mixed race owned by President Thomas Jefferson, and she was the mother of several of his children. There are no surviving photos of Sally Hemings' children, but the man pictured on the left in that portrait is Beverly Frederick Hemings, her grandson. DNA studies on that case began in 1998. And finally, in the middle, a case that most of you are probably very familiar with, the Golden State Killer. In addition to being a serial killer, he was a serial rapist, a serial burglar. He was a police officer from 1973 into the late 80s, I believe, or 90s. He's accused of committing at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and 120 burglaries across California between 1973 and 1986. The modern type genetic genealogy was applied to his case in 2016 from a piece of evidence. He was arrested on April 24th, 2018, and he was just convicted on June 29th, 2020. So the advantages of autosomal SNP forensic genealogy are mostly in missing persons identifications and in suspect identifications. So in missing persons, it's more SNP analysis is more discriminative than mitochondrial DNA testing, and thus it's more accurate and can lead to shorter investigative times. For suspect identification, SNPs are far more discriminative than familial STR testing that you may use with your convicted offender DNA database. As I mentioned earlier, you search these large non-criminal databases, and that too can shorten your investigative time. Even if a person is not identified, it will yield additional information such as ancestry and phenotypic markers. The disadvantages of autosomal SNP forensic genealogy are, number one, the technology is not something most laboratories have, and I'll get into that more a bit later. You have to use massively parallel sequencing, also called NGS, next generation sequencing. You must have a single source sample, so that's very difficult in forensic cases. And you must have a lot of it, which is also very difficult, especially if you're dealing with old cases, cold cases. You need to have at least a microgram of DNA for best results. The instrumentations, consumables, and reagents are more costly than CE, capillary electrophoresis. And of course, you have to have trained personnel. It's a completely different laboratory technique. And you also need these genealogies that are trained to be able to reconstruct these family trees. And that can take weeks or months to do properly. There are privacy concerns. Initially, the privacy concern was that all people in these open public genetic genealogy databases were open to law enforcement. And now you have to opt in to have your profile searched by law enforcement. But it goes beyond, as I mentioned, it goes beyond just your own individual privacy. It could affect your relatives up to third and fourth cousins. Courts could also force commercial firms to open their entire database to genetic genealogy for law enforcement purposes. There are no scientific guidelines or federal rules or laws currently, at least in the United States, and in most places around the world that govern this technology. Some future potential. Next generation sequencing technology will become more common in public forensic testing laboratories. Again, I'll speak to that at the end on my fourth topic. Criminalists will need to be trained in forensic genealogy, or you have to hire specialists. And we all know how difficult it is to hire in a crime laboratory. Scientific boards will need to be established, will need to establish guidelines and set standards. Local jurisdictions will need to establish rules and laws for public laboratories. This website that I mentioned below gives a wealth of information. It's the International Society of Genetic Genealogy. It's not too technical, and I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in this topic. The second technology that I'm discussing is rapid DNA. Here are two instruments, one from Applied Biosystems, the Thermo Fisher Applied Biosystems, called the Rapid HID system, and the other one by a company called ANDE, A-N-D-E. Their Rapid DNA instrument is pictured there on the right. Rapid DNA is a fully automated method for developing CODIS STR profiles from a single source sample. That's how it was designed, for a single source sample. Typically, it's a buccal swab, and it only takes 90 to 120 minutes. Rapid DNA analysis occurs in a single instrument that you see here that performs extraction, amplification, separation, detection, and allele calling, all without human intervention. It was designed for in-the-field use by operators without forensic testing. The advantages of the current technology of rapid DNA are for mass fatalities, for quick identification of victims and potentially large numbers of body parts from natural disasters, commercial travel, or industrial accidents, as well as terrorist attacks. It can be also used and is used in suspect identification, rapid identification of suspects in police custody, the so-called in U.S. states with arrestee laws, where everybody arrested of certain crimes has to give a buccal swab. And that, again, within 120 minutes, a DNA profile is generated and it is eligible for searching against the National DNA Index system. But the real question is, can it be used on criminal evidence? Can it be used at crime scenes? Just 2 months ago, a position statement was issued in the Forensic Science International Genetics Journal. 3 groups, ENSFI, the European Network, SWIGDAM, the American Network, and a separate FBI task force got together and stated that 5 improvements must be made before rapid DNA instruments can be used on criminal evidence. These are, number 1, you must have an internal control for low quantity, degradation, and inhibition. It could be a single internal control or 3 separate controls. That will be difficult to do technologically. Number 2, you must be able to export raw data and to be able to analyze the data off instrument. Already the ANDI instrument can do that. You must have expert system to flag allele calls for human review, especially if they are from low-level mixtures. You must improve p-kite ratio balance for low quantity and mixture samples. And finally, you must publish an extensive developmental validation on a wide variety of forensic type samples, and this has not been completed yet. So there are some big challenges to meet these recommendations by those 3 groups. The disadvantages of rapid DNA are, number 1, analyses are performed outside of an accredited crime laboratory environment. You're dealing with weather, with harsh environments potentially. There are opportunities for sample mix-up, contamination, and operator error. Of course, you have all those potential problems inside a laboratory, but in a controlled environment, you're much more able to have controls to prevent such things or to detect such things if they do happen. As mentioned, rapid DNA instruments cannot currently interpret mixed samples. Results are not acceptable in many courts that we know of. Challenges really haven't made it through to the court system yet. And results are not uploadable to the National DNA Index system, the CODIS system, if it's from a crime scene sample. So future possibilities, manufacturers may adopt recommendations as stated above, then rapid DNA at crime scenes will be more common. They do that. And there's some major technological challenges that took many, many years, over a decade to get the instruments where they are today. So I think these are big challenges for them. The other big challenge is, in my opinion, is these rapid DNA instruments are based on technology, capillary electrophoresis technology from the 1990s. It's not new or innovative technology, it's just a shrinking of our current technology that we've had for a couple decades. And because these are CE-based instruments, they cannot expand much further than the 20 CODIS core loci. I think in the future, longer-term future, human identification methods will likely move towards SNPs, which is my 4th topic. First in the lab and then potentially beyond the laboratory. And of course, SNPs are beyond the capability of capillary electrophoresis instruments. An alternative for in-the-field human identification will more likely move towards these advanced technologies, such as nanopore sequencing, as their methods improve, both statistical methods and operational methods. Okay, the 3rd topic that I'm here to discuss is the use of next-generation sequencing technology, again in criminal cases. There are 2 current next-gen sequencing instruments that are developed and marketed towards the forensic community. The MySeq, which is an Illumina instrument, marketed by Illumina spin-off company called Verigen, and Thermo Fisher, their ION S5 system, which includes an ION Chef, which is a very small robotic instrument. It's the 2nd next-gen sequencing technology for criminal cases. Here's a list of the current tests for both STR and mitochondrial DNA. Each of the major companies in forensics that have developed a test. Forensic is by Illumina or Verigen. The Precision ID Global Filer System, they're from Thermo Fisher. PowerSeq is from Promega. And the QIAseq is from QIAGEN. So there are these tests that are currently available, and I'm sure more are being developed as we speak. In a survey of 33 European laboratories from 25 countries, they found that 17 of those labs had purchased at least one next-generation sequencing instrument. And they have been testing, validating, and in some cases they are online with criminal case evidence as we speak. In May 2019, the NDS board in the United States of the US FBI laboratory began accepting data from approved kits for upload into the National DNA database. However, the CODA software is not capable of storing, searching, or maintaining information on XSTRs or identity SNPs. Only DNA records relating to the length polymorphisms of the required corpus loci are accepted and uploaded and searched. The big advantage of next generation sequencing is that it's a sequencing technology. So CE is a length-based polymorphism technology. So you're losing a lot of information, and CODIS can't handle this information of base pair polymorphisms within the alleles that are occurring, and that helps a lot with mixture interpretation. Some advantages of NGS, incidentally, NGS sequencing of mitochondrial DNA is already about 20 times more sensitive than Sanger sequencing. So laboratories should hop on that technology train quickly if they do mitochondrial DNA sequencing. There's higher discrimination of using the sequence compared to the length of an STR allele, again, because there are sequence differences within a length polymorphism in many cases. You can get more information from degraded DNA. And again, with mixture interpretation, you can resolve up to 5 individuals in a single mixture, is what has been reported to date. Some future possibilities. This is just one, but any technology, current or future, is right for the forensic community. Single molecule real-time sequencing is a very interesting technology because it eliminates PCR errors. So it eliminates one source of errors that now traditional next-gen sequencing technology has to deal with. This instrument by PacBio is capable of very long reads, high accuracy, uniform coverage, and single molecule resolution. There are a lot of challenges to this technology. There's a lack of consistent nomenclature and reporting standards. There's a lack of compatibility with existing national DNA database software. There's a lack of population data to support these statistical calculations. All of the population data from STRs is based on length polymorphism, not sequence polymorphism. There's a lack of an adequate legislative framework to deal with this type of data. The analysis software needs quite a bit of improvement. It can be a little clunky. It's not user-friendly. Of course, there's a huge disincentive to change. We all know how much lab employees enjoy change. It's even worse in the courts, where the law is based on tradition, not state-of-the-art technology. It's more expensive than current technologies. That may go down, but it may not. There's privacy concerns because we're looking at SNPs that can detect phenotypes, and it can look at your ancestry and so on. And currently, throughput capacity is very low. In order to get the sensitivity similar to capillary electrophoresis sensitivity, you can't put very many samples on a single chip. so throughput capacity is low, and because you can't put a lot of samples on a single chip, that makes it very, very expensive, as these chips cost $3,000 or $4,000 each. The journal Electrophoresis had a special issue dealing with this topic in forensic analysis, and I left a link there, which will bring you to the table of contents of that special issue. Finally, I'm here to talk about probabilistic genotyping. Probabilistic methods of mixture interpretation have allowed laboratories to analyze, the ability to analyze cases that were too complex for the traditional binary interpretation. Therefore, probabilistic software will be and has become an integral component of the DNA testing procedure. There has been significant adoption of probabilistic genotyping systems by forensic laboratories in recent years. As you can see from this slide, the trends in forensic biology are to interpret cases that were too complex, increasing adoption of probabilistic genotyping, increase kit sensitivity, increase submissions, complex mixtures, low-level trace samples. All of these things increase complexity, and you really need a software to help you interpret the meaning of your laboratory results. Probabilistic genotyping is our best method to date to do that. Here's a reference. Each of the three regulators that or standards bodies that I've mentioned, SWGDAM, the ISFG, and the UK Forensic Regulator have all published recommendations for developmental and internal validation of probabilistic genotyping. So if you're just starting on this journey, this is the place you should start. Probabilistic genotyping methods reduce, but they do not eliminate the number of subjective decisions made by an analyst. But it will improve your consistency if everybody is interpreting things in a similar way and utilizing probabilistic genotyping in a similar way. Again, it will reduce decisions and increase consistency, but it won't eliminate them entirely. Future possibilities, improvements in the estimation of the number of contributors in the mixture. The data, or the software, excuse me, needs to, the CODA software, the database, the DNA database software needs to be modified to accept NGS data. And the software needs to be improved to allow you to interpret mixtures with haploid marker systems such as mitochondrial DNA and YSTR for mixture analysis. So thank you. That was a whirlwind tour of 4 big topics in the future of forensic DNA analysis. And like Bruce, I look forward to answering your questions at the conclusion of the next talk.
Thanks very much, Tim, for that presentation. And we'll move on to our third presenter now, Erich Smith, to talk to us about the future directions in firearms. Over to you, Erich.
Thanks, Tony. I'm really happy to be here today, be able to talk to you guys about my unit and some of the things we've done recently, probably in the past decade, to talk about taking a discipline that's old in forensics and kind of bring it into a new realm with new technologies. So I'm going to talk about a few instruments that we have in-house, and we don't support any particular company. Just kind of give you a caveat that these are just instruments that we're evaluating within our laboratory to see if they best fit in our practices. Okay. There are a couple of articles that were critical of forensic science or offered some insight into how to improve forensic sciences here in the United States. And one is the 2009 forensic report on forensic sciences from the NAS. That one, we spent a lot of time at the FBI laboratory looking at and trying to see how we can improve our process. And then also there's the PCAS, which was more of a kind of general overview of the sciences and some criticism. But I really want to focus on the NAS report from 2009. One of the criticisms was that in our discipline, there's nothing that we can bring, or when I go to court and I offer testimony about my decision, it's my opinion. I can't bring in, like my previous predecessors that just spoke, any type of quantitative value to my decision. So about a decade ago, after looking at this, the FBI laboratory started to reflect on all of our disciplines, and we tried to see how we could improve. And for my discipline, it was, can we bring something to our decision-making that can somehow bring a score, basically, or bring some objective measure to our decision-making. So myself and a couple other examiners and researchers decided on a path forward on how we could achieve this. Being that we really wanted to, our gold standard was we wanted to bring some objective evidence to the decision, but along the way, we were going to be evaluating instruments that may provide better tools to do our current workflow with traditional light comparison microscopy. So we broke it into two phases. Phase one is where we actually look at these instruments and see, can they provide similar or better quality images that we would normally get from a light comparison microscope. And then along the way, we're collecting data. We're collecting scan data that we can use for objective measures along the way. And towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about, in the phase two, we're moving forward to what's called rapid fit. That's a reference population of firearm tool marks database that will eventually get us to that point where we can probably give some statistical inference on what our decision means. So back in 2012, we started purchasing a lot of different instruments for our unit. We're very fortunate that our laboratory management was very keen on trying to bring more information to bear on our decisions. So the first machine that we bought or had in-house was by Cadre Forensics, which is their top match system, which is pictured on the bottom right. This is their older system, but it is the one that we used and validated in-house. We have their latest version, which allows for high capacity scanning. So instead of traditional scanning one cartridge case or one bullet at a time, they now have a system that can do up to 15 at one time. We also have a Sensifar confocal interferometry scope. That one, that's more of our research equipment. We use that primarily for scanning bullets to get their topographies. We also have an Alicona infinite focus with focus variation. And we just recently had a new addition where it has robotics. So for if you're trying to build a database of known tool marks, you need to scan a lot of tool marks. This robot's going to come in handy where we can just set it up, leave it, and then come back later to look for all the scan data. We have a couple of instruments from Europe. We have the EVA Finder, which has been around for quite a while, and it's made its way here in the United States into several laboratories, even Orange County's, I believe. This one is all a self-contained system. It uses photometric, it's a combination of photometric and focus variation to scan bullets and cartridge cases. It's all self-contained, and it has software that's very familiar to firearms examiners. It also has an algorithm in the background that'll help establish what would be the best match against a database. And then we have a Czechoslovakian machine that's called ToolScan. It works very similar on photometric, stereo, and focus variation, but this one is specifically at looking at tools. So we have a pretty good, robust collection of tools or instruments. And one thing I really wanted to point out, we learned some good lessons from our latent print folks. Early on, when they were looking at IAFIS type of machines, different companies came up with their own proprietary software as well as file format. So one of the limitations is the different systems couldn't talk to one another. You'd have to have either instrument A or have a combination of instrument A and B, but they wouldn't talk to each other. One of the key things when being on the OSAC, one of the things that we were very cognizant of is making sure that all these different instruments would be able to talk to one another. So the key file format that all of these scans are being saved in is X3P. This is an ISO standard format, and what this allows, for me at the FBI to do, if there's a case in Orange County and I need to look at that, I can have the file sent to me on whatever instrument they collected it on, and now I can read it in-house. So you're not locked into one particular company. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. So in-house, we wanted to validate the phase 1 capability of looking at these instruments for virtual comparison microscopy. So part of our accreditation with ANAB, formerly ASCLD Lab, we had to come up with a validation plan before we proceeded. So we have that available. It's actually online where people can take a look at it and see how we went ahead and validated one of these particular systems for virtual comparison microscopy. And the first one we worked with was the Cadre. And we asked the manufacturer to do several things to their software. Their system also has an algorithm which will also help select the best candidate that might match your question item. But we didn't want that to give any kind of guidance to the examiner. So we asked them to blind that, remove the algorithm, and create a software where we can look at 2 specimens side by side and compare them. We went ahead, we're lucky we have proficiency tests that date pretty far back, all the way as far back as 2003. And we scanned all those proficiency tests into the system, giving each of the samples a unique identifier, and then we assembled them into test packets and delivered them to the examiners within the lab to evaluate. So you can imagine we have this one terminal. An examiner might be asked to, if they have some free time, to go in there and take a few of these tests. The tests were proctored by our visiting scientists to make sure that if the examiner had some issues with the software, if they weren't very familiar with it, it just gave them some guidance on that. But it was also to kind of control the exchange of information so that there was no potential information gleaned by another examiner on how they came up to their decision. One of the other elements that we looked at outside of the proficiency test, we decided as a laboratory to start collecting in our discipline what we called consecutively manufactured items. And these are akin to what we consider our best known non-match. The idea that if I buy 2 firearms that were made consecutively, the tool marks are going to be most similar between those 2 because you've caught the tool in its constant state of wear. So we went ahead and bought numerous barrels and slides that were made consecutively from the manufacturers. We built tests for them as well to give to the examiners to see how they performed. And along with this validation process, in order to be successful, we called out that there couldn't be any false positives or false negative source conclusion decisions. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of walk you through one of the proficiency tests and show you the data on that, the best known non-match, and kind of give you an idea of where I thought we were as a laboratory and as a unit as far as validating. So this is typically what I'm trying to illustrate here is what an examiner would see under their light comparison microscope in their laboratory. So we're looking at 2 sets of knowns, and they're being asked to compare them. And if you look at the 2 on the left, they're in one position, and then the 2 on the right, they've just been rotated 90 degrees. And the reason I did that, if you look at the pairing on the right, you can see like a wavy pattern at the top from the tool mark, from the breech face that made its way onto the cartridge case. So this is typically how we would see it under the comparison microscope. This is how the same two cartridge cases look that were paired on the right. The detail that we would see under scanned conditions as opposed to light comparison microscopy. This is the software setup that we asked the company to make. If you look at the bottom left of that image, there's a little window there, and you can see all the candidates that the examiner can select from to bring up to one of the bigger windows to compare. If you look at the top, there's a little ball there. What that allows the user to do is they can spin the ball, and it virtually changes the light and its angle of incident across the cartridge case. One of the advantages of this type of system is if we look back at this one here, and you look at the depression, what we call the firing pin impression in the dead center, you see a very bright white hot spot. That is the limitation of the system. It creates reflectance from the light source, so you wash out a lot of detail. When you go back and you look at it virtually, you don't have that limitation. You are looking at a rendering of the X, Y, and Z measurements of those cartridge cases rendered virtually. So we have the actual physical measurements of that tool mark contained there. Here's just another example zoomed in closely. The nice thing about this, as far as efficiency, if I were to put another candidate up there, it would come right to the exact same position. Unlike in a light comparison microscopy, you have to manipulate it to try to get it into the same position. This system is going to set it up in its proper orientation. All right, so after we went to the proficiency test, we had 927 virtual comparisons with no false identifications. However, we did have one false elimination. So I just want to kind of illustrate the magnitude of the number of tests. So this is just an Excel spreadsheet, and you can look at the tabs at the bottom. I'm really fortunate that the examiners in my unit, they're amenable to actually doing these tests because there are a number of them. But under test number 4, we did happen to have a false elimination. So as far as the researcher, what I wanted to do is actually go back and do a root cause on what could have been the possibility for that false elimination. And in that particular instance, the scan picked up some artifacts in the firing pin, and that was used as a source for elimination. We repackaged that test, delivered it again after some training, and we were able to achieve the right results the second time around. All right, so that's just looking at the proficiency test side of the validation. Now we wanted to look at best known non-matches. And in this situation, we're looking at worst case scenario. For law enforcement, this typically is going to happen when there's a law enforcement shooting. You could potentially have guns at a scene that were manufactured very close to one another because law enforcement buys guns in lots, and they're made roughly around the same time. So in this case, we have a Smith & Wesson M&P pistol, 9mm pistol. This is what it looks under the comparison microscope. And now this is what it looks like virtually and scanned. And what I wanted to illustrate, so we're looking at the same two pairings. This is an ID. If you're looking at the traditional light comparison microscopy on the left, and if you look at the dividing line, the black line, you can see there's some striations there. And for the firearms examiners, they understand that's from the shearing and the operation of the firearm. But if you draw your attention to the one on the right, the virtual one, with the dividing line down the center, and look at the same shearing detail, as the user, you can see there's less interference from the light source and you see more detail of the actual tool mark. Unlike on the picture on the left with the LCM, where you have some interference in the lighting. One thing I would like to point out, as part of our validation, in our reference collection, we have approximately 9,000 firearms, and we selected the 9mm caliber to focus in on our validation. So all of our firearms in the 9mm category have been test fired at least 11 times to give known samples using different brands of ammunition. So if you look at the picture on the left and the information below it, when it tells you it's unique identifier 531, it's Winchester ammunition and it's a particular brand and it's a multiple test fire from that. So with the consecutively manufactured slides, we had no false positives or false negatives. Additionally, for test number 11 that I produced, there were no matching pairs. So the examiner was sitting there looking at numerous pairings. Probably their expectation is that there's got to be a match here. All the class characteristics are the same. So I kind of put them in a very tight crucible to kind of push them, to make them try to make the wrong decision. And they still were spot on. They made no incorrect decisions. All right, so I kind of asked a question at this point because to me, I had written up the validation plan and I felt like at this point, I had really good confidence that this system, using it virtually, was going to be as good or not better than traditional light comparison microscopy. But at my laboratory, it's not just because I feel confident and I'm the technical leader that it gets a blessing. I had to give a review to my quality assurance unit, show them all the data that I collected, and then I also gave it to my senior scientist to review. And they didn't think there was enough there yet. They said it was great, we're close, but what they wanted to do in addition to that is now look at casework. How would the same performance, or what would the performance be like if now examiners were looking at casework? So to kind of give you some context, in the FBI lab, we have blind verification. And what that basically means is I may be the primary examiner, I do all of my exams, and then my conclusions are sealed away from another examiner. They have to do the same evaluation, and then the two results are compared to one another to see if they match. So we took that particular case as well as other casework to evaluate how would the examiners now perform. Would they get the same results that they did using light comparison microscopy, this time using evidence? The critical component here is there's no ground truth with evidence. We don't know factually if this is the correct answer, but we do know, these are the opinions, whether it's identification or eliminations that the examiners have reached. So in order to try to bridge that, with ground truths, we test fired from our collection several guns and interspersed samples from that with the evidence. So we had ground truths to compare to see how they were performing as well. So this is actual evidence in one of our cases. And if you can see, you've got the firing pin impression dead center. At around the 11 o'clock, right around the ring, if you focus on the image on the right, you can see a nice little divot around the 11 o'clock position. Well, that's from the ejector. If you look at the one on the left from light comparison microscopy, yeah, I can see it's there, but the detail is not as clear. Also, on the image on the right, you can see very faint parallel lines running through it from east to west. That's from the breech face. They're almost non-existent or very subtle on the image on the left. So the detail is still much better using this instrument for comparison virtually. And this is just an example of one of the ground truths that was nestled in there so that we could see how the examiners performed against knowns. So after all this, our senior scientists were very satisfied that this was suitable for casework. We had, to date, when we produced this, over 3,400 virtual comparisons with no false positives, 916 virtual comparisons using casework. One of the key things a lot of laboratory management asked me is, well, what happened if somebody had a different decision when they used VCM versus LCM. And we had that. We had a situation where an examiner who did it using LCM now made an identification using VCM, and other examiners agreed as well. So for the laboratory, we've made the conscious decision that in this situation, we bring the evidence back and actually look at it again, and we would offer another opinion if it was different from the original decision that was made. One thing I would like to point out is our SOPs are online, and I give you the web address there. And you can go right to it. You can see the tree to where our SOP is located, and where you will find a example of how we took VCM and married it up to our SOPs. We're not doing anything different than we normally would do with LCM, light comparison microscopy. We just have a different instrument that allows us to visualize the tool mark. Additionally, we're required to put in our reports the limitations of whatever exam that we do. So in this case, VCM had to be called out, and what are the limitations? So in everything that I've just illustrated to you, one of the limitations is I can't see the total cartridge case. I'm only seeing the breech face and the shearing. Also, with that particular system, I can't even see the firing pin impression. So if it cannot scan it, then I cannot see it. So that is a critical limitation of the system. So one of the reasons that we put that into our report is so that if we are not there to testify in court, the court does have the availability to them to understand what we did and what would be the limitations to a particular decision. So now I want to kind of walk you through what is actually going on currently with VCM in our laboratory. And the instrument that's pictured on the right is the one I talked about early on. This is now the multiple point entry system by Cadre. It's going to collect 15 scans of a cartridge case in one setup. Right now, when evidence comes into our lab, it goes into our LIMS, our laboratory information system. So we've asked all the manufacturers to kind of be able to talk to our LIMS system. And so the idea is that, and actually in this particular case, Cadre will query our laboratory information system every 5 or 10 minutes. And our laboratory information system is providing CSV files on new casework that contain bullets, cartridge cases, and firearms. What that does is that allows the reduction of redundancy by an operator to try to have, okay, I'm going to put it into my LIMS system now, and now I have to go over to this instrument and put the same information in. So now Cadre is getting pre-populated with the case number, specimen numbers, as well as test fires and firearms. It all gets pre-populated into the software, and now it comes back after it's populated in the software. It has 2 routes. The examiner can go through an inconclusive route, or they can choose, they can use light comparison microscopy, the traditional method, or they can choose to use VCM. Just sit right down at their terminal at their desk and start comparing them. Along the way, we did decide to make a decision about inconclusive. If you were going to do traditional light comparison microscopy, and I came up to the decision of inconclusive, before there was VCM, this other instrument to work with, that would go out as an inconclusive decision in the report. But now I have this additional tool that might provide additional information. I'm required to now actually go to VCM. If I've gone my traditional route and I'm inconclusive, I have to go to VCM. And conversely, if I'm going through VCM and I'm inconclusive, I still have to go back to light comparison microscopy because of the limitation of the instrument. I can't see the whole breadth of all the tool marks that are available, from the chamber mark to the firing pin impression. So either way, if I'm inconclusive, I'm going to have to take the track, either VCM or LCM, to complete my examination. Right, so this is kind of, I want to kind of give you a context of how this is helped us in casework. So this is an actual case. We use VCM. And I want you to, the depression in the center of the 2 cartridge cases is the firing pin impression. And right around, if you look at the image on the right, there's a defect right around the rim, and the other one doesn't have that, okay? And you're going to see a stark contrast between how these look using LCM and what they look like in VCM. So this would be this teeters on the edge of being inconclusive right here. And this is what it looks like using VCM. We see a lot more texture and a lot more detail of the tool mark. So using VCM, this decision is an identification in this case. Okay. So this is all this validation work got these instruments into the lab, working tangential to our traditional method, just giving us another tool to visualize how these tool marks look. But along the way, we're collecting a lot of objective data. So that's the springboard into our phase 2 future work. Okay. So this is a big roadmap, but I want you to kind of understand where we're going. So phase 2, it really involves NIST and the National Forensics Institute in the Netherlands. We've been working together for almost going on 3 years now, working on a population database. And this population database is going to be a collection of both impressed and striated tool marks. So this is kind of give you an idea of where we're going. So the evidence that comes in the lab, we've got a question cartridge case, and we've got a suspect firearm. And of course, the question is, did this firearm fire this cartridge case? The expectation is we're still going to be using light comparison microscopy or VCM. The examiner is going to be looking at them and making a decision. And if it's an identification, you're already going to have, if you look below the check mark, 2 scanned files of the one on the right being the test fire and the one on the left being the question cartridge case. Now, whether it's Cadre, EvoFinder, or any of the other instruments that have an algorithm, it might tell you these 2, I believe there's a lot of similarities between these 2, and these 2, essentially, we believe that they match, okay? Now, what we would do is now we're going to take that information and we're going to push it against the relevant reference population database. So if you look on the right, we have different distributions of known matches and known non-matches of different types of firearms. Okay. So in this situation, we have a Glock pistol. That's the most relevant population. We're going to be looking at Glocks. We're also going to collect a lot of information about the particular ammunition. Ammunition can play a particular role in how the tool mark actually reproduces. So there's going to be a lot of metadata about the ammunition and the class characteristics of that particular firearm. So I apologize, it seems to be frozen. Okay. So we had CMC stands for consecutively matching cells. So the score from our previous comparison was 20. And that's very good, actually. And it's pushed against the reference population database that's relevant, being other Glocks. And you see that 20 compared to the known matches, which is represented by the red bars, and the blue ones being the known non-matches, it scores pretty high, and there's plenty of evidence that the similarities which suggest that they came from the same source. So this is where we're kind of moving forward as a science to this level, where the examiner is still critical, is still the critical component of making that decision, but now we're going to have some objective measure to compare that with. Okay. Now in closing, I did want to point out a couple things. We have a working group here in the United States that actually has international membership. We formed it about 4 years ago. It's the topical working group for 3D technologies. And we're going to be introducing a website here probably before the end of the year that'll outline best practices and standards for these types of instruments and their use in the forensic laboratories. And also available, since we at the FBI lab have numerous consecutively manufactured samples, we're populating this database or this website with training sets that laboratories can then pull down and now use themselves. So these will give a kind of universal awareness for different laboratories and different trainees that they are looking at apples to apples when they're looking at best known non-matches, which is something that we would like to provide to the community. So in closing, that's all I have. We've been doing quite a bit, and I will be happy to take any questions either here or you can email me my email address. And make sure you wash your hands. Keep calm. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eric. So we're going to open the floor now to questions for the three presenters. And again, I'd ask you to use the Q&A window to ask your questions of the presenters. And I'll be reading from that area to identify questions. So our first question is for Bruce. Bruce, I have a question here, very specific question about LCMS. And the questioner asks, we use LCMS with a Q exactive orbit trap for screening and toxicology, but we have doubts about whether to use it in target mode or in non-target mode. Which one of these modes of operation is expected to be more common in forensic toxicology in the future?
So I've never used the orbit trap, so I'm a little bit naive on how that specific ion trap works, but obviously a high-res ion trap. But most laboratories that I'm aware of are actually using target mode. So they'll take a particular set of drugs or compounds where they know the parent, and they do the cascading after that. So it's a targeted set. In the future, I would expect, if the processing power of the computers that control these instruments continue to improve, and I think if the sensitivity gets better, I think a non-target mode actually might be a little bit easier. But my personal opinion, and it's somewhat limited, but my personal opinion is the target mode will stay around for a while.
Thanks, Bruce. Our next question is for Tim. Tim, any thoughts about the use of the human microbiome as an alternative to current human identification methods?
Hi, I am no expert on the human microbiome. I know there's some very good research going on in that realm. It is a possibility. One thing that does concern me about this technology is that it can change over time, right? If you live with a particular set of roommates or family for a particular amount of time, and then change your living arrangements, your microbiome can change slightly. So I'm not sure how sensitive that would be to change, how actual unique it is to human identification, but it's something that should be explored, and it is a very exciting bit of technology that we're just learning more and more about every day.
Thanks, Tim. Question for Eric. So Eric, as you're aware, there's been a number of recent decisions in the US involving firearms evidence and the admissibility of opinion evidence related to forensic firearms analysis. I'm wondering, what's the impact of that on the current state of forensic firearms analysis, and what do you think would be the future impact of some of these decisions?
That's a good question. So yes, for our discipline here in the United States, there have been several rulings that have limited the amount the examiner could opine about. And for my discipline, in certain situations where the examiner may have made an identification in the casework, the court ruled that they could only keep it at a class characteristic level. So it kind of reduced the importance of their decision. In reviewing the transcripts, and that's probably what I would suggest anybody that really wanted some information about what actually transpired in those caseworks or those court cases, is looking at the transcripts, you kind of have an understanding that there may have been a disconnect between the judge or the examiner testifying or the court officials presenting the information that was available. So a decision may have been rendered. The judge may have not had everything at his disposal to make a proper decision. These decisions will be with us for a while. hopefully, as we move forward with these other technologies, they'll offer more evidence to suggest that, the examiners, when they render a decision of identification, yes, they're getting it correct. There is a tendency by the courts to look at error rates in studies. So there are quite a few validation studies that have been done in our discipline. And the error rate hovers between 1% and 2%, depending on which study you look at. And there's a false tendency to figure, well, if it's 1% error rate, that translates to every time I make a decision, 1 out of 100 is incorrect. And that's an incorrect assumption based on the error rate. And that's not being articulated in some of these court cases. There's a way to illustrate, and I think that's what the court's looking for, is they want to know, when I'm giving that opinion, what's the possibility that I'm making a wrong decision? So that information is not being provided to the court, I don't think, effectively.
And Eric, you referenced in your presentation that one of the objectives of the use of the virtual microscopy and the analysis that you just described was the ability to, at some point, add some sort of statistical weight to the determination that you make about the similarity of a fired cartridge case, a crime scene case, and a test fired cartridge case. What would that specifically look like? So what would the statistic look like in something like that?
Right, so that bridge hasn't been crossed yet. So is it going to be a likelihood ratio, or is it going to be a strict error rate? That hasn't really been vetted out, how that's going to be articulated. That could be dependent on a state. The state may figure, if the FBI is maintaining the database, imagine Bruce is in California and his examiners want to ping the national toolmark database called RapidFit to find out, out of all the cartridge cases in your collection, what's the likelihood that my test fire matches your database? How they articulate that may be dependent on the state level. It hasn't been determined if it's going to be a federal mandate. We haven't gotten to that point yet. So,
Thank you. Tim, in your presentation, you talked about rapid DNA and also next generation sequencing, and you overlap that with the current sort of traditional approach with STRs. Do you see the potential, depending on the case specifics, for the concurrent use of those technologies? Do you see them overlapping each other or being used concurrently in some situations?
Rapid DNA, and what was the first one?
Next gen.
There, you could. I mean, just like it's the same as combining next-gen sequencing with traditional laboratory CE analysis. You'll get a lot more information from next-gen sequencing. So maybe the author of this question is asking about, could you use rapid as a screening tool, and then if that looks positive, go forward with next-gen sequencing. That is a possibility. Rapid DNA testing right now, it's a cartridge-based system, and those cartridges are very expensive. So traditional laboratory analysis is still far cheaper than rapid DNA. So the real beauty of rapid DNA is that it's a ruggedized instrument that can be used in the field, which is why I was looking, even further afar into, nanopore technology, sequencing technologies, and things like that. But if cost is not a concern, then by all means you can use rapid DNA as screening. You don't need to enter it into CODIS, and then you go on to something that's port worthy and DNA database worthy.
Thank you. That's a good segue to the next question, which is around costs, and probably a good one for Bruce. So given the broad scope of the different analyses that are possible and the complexity and the costs that you described in your presentation, Bruce, would it be an effective strategy for some sort of centralization of a drug or tox testing instead of having all labs try to come up with their own solutions? And that's for testing. I think the questioner is asking about testing as well as training and so on.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I don't know if there's a clear answer one way or the other. It really depends, I think, on the jurisdiction and what the needs of your stakeholders are. So you're going to have to balance risk versus reward and how you do this. There are a lot of states that are doing this. They're centralized here in the United States. They're centralizing their analyses in one lab and moving a different discipline to another lab, for example. Particularly the smaller states do this traditionally. California is very big. We have very large cities, and so though we have a state lab, we have individual city labs. But the local labs give you the ability to meet the needs of your stakeholders and clients quicker and more directly, and so there's advantages to doing that. It really comes down to money and what your stakeholders want. You can do both. I mean, you can have central labs for more complicated things. You can have targeted laboratories for specific types of analyses that are simple, let's say drugs of abuse, like cocaine or the methamphetamine, for example. So I don't know if I can give you a direct, clear answer on the preference, but it really depends on how much money you've got, whether you're able to do it. I think, you know, in a perfect world, if you have unlimited resources, I think you'd want to have as broad a set of analyses as possible, but none of us live in that world, unfortunately. So it's a balancing act. We have, even in Orange County, we have limited resources, but we have to budget years ahead for specific types of instruments. And we have grants. We have partners that we worked with, like Office of Traffic Safety, and the country has NHTSA, which is actually doing a lot of funding in driving toxicology, which has enabled us in partnership with Orange County over the course of maybe 3 or 4 years when we started this to move to LC triple quads and QTOFs. That was a big investment on our part, and it took a few years to do it, but there's been big savings to do that down the road. So planning early, spread it out over time if you can, but yeah, you may have to. If you don't have the resources, you may have to centralize if your clients and stakeholders can take it.
Thank you. Tim, the next question is about probabilistic genotyping. And so like many new technologies, when it was first introduced, there was some controversy or concern raised about its admissibility, whether it was sort of this black box program, and whether it really was as objective as it claimed to be. Have those issues been addressed now? Is it been smooth sailing in the courts? And what's the future look like for probabilistic genotyping?
Those questions have not been eliminated. There will continue to be challenges. These are proprietary algorithms. One of the major manufacturers in the United States will not reveal that algorithm, but he will testify in court and explain it. The other major manufacturer that's located in New Zealand does reveal the algorithm to the court itself under confidentiality. But the defense will always argue, in my opinion, they'll always argue it's a black box and you don't really know what the algorithm is doing. And there's been a lot of bad press about algorithms, of course. They can be biased. They take on the biases of the programmer and that sort of thing. So it's, anytime you're dealing with computer algorithms or artificial intelligence or machine learning, you have to answer and address those questions. And those will be with us for decades to come, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Next question is for Erich, and it's around the use of the likelihood ratio. You touched on that briefly in your presentation. Is that an option that's being used right now in forensic firearms analysis? And is it something that might be, and if not, is it something that might be used in the future to express the significance of findings?
Right, so my laboratory doesn't use likelihood ratios, and I can speak that the NFI in the Netherlands, they do use likelihood ratios when reporting. So that is one laboratory that I do know uses them. Is it possible that could be used in the future? Sure. These instruments are collecting a lot of data, and it's basically how are you going to present the data that they've created for you. Basically, we've asked these instruments to replicate what the examiner is already doing at their comparison scope, and now encapsulating it into X, Y, and Z data. And how we express that to the court or to whoever our user is in the end, we haven't crossed that bridge yet. We just, it's too, this is kind of this is a brave new world for us, our discipline. So I don't know what's the best route, but it is nice to know that there are laboratories that are out there, specifically in Europe, that do use likelihood ratios, and you can see what value they may bring to them. I don't know if that's going to translate here in the United States.
Bruce, you had mentioned, or you had a slide at the end of your presentation with a series of questions. Are there any from that slide that you'd like to draw from? Those were questions that were pre-submitted to us that you'd like to draw from to address?
Sure. I think one was on the orbit trap, which we've already addressed. I think there's one online question about GCIRD. And I do think in seized drugs, GCIRD is definitely a valuable technique. It's one of those increase your breadth of analyses of benefits. Infrared can give you, depending on the compound, but it give you, solid detail like a mass spec can, and so it can give you another form of confirmatory analysis. So it's a very good technique. We have two here. I don't know if it is used obviously as broadly as GCMS is, and unfortunately there are not enough vendors in this space to get some really good competition going. So it's a little bit more limited, but we've been very fortunate to use it and have actually liked using it. The only other question I think I have was the handheld portable detectors. I alluded to this just a little bit about field testing. So when obviously fentanyl was making its increase in the United States, we were concerned for our investigators and law enforcement staff touching powders and packaging and so forth. So right now they don't open the packaging anymore and do powder tests, and things are sent directly to the laboratory. So we've been testing different types of portable units, which were mostly Raman, and depending on the type of packaging that you have and whether the light can actually transmit through that packaging, there's different levels of success. But a lot of laboratories and jurisdictions are actually using these as an assist for what you're doing in the field. They're not fully confirmatory, but they can actually help you distinctly. So those have some benefits. And I think there are 3 or 4 manufacturers on the market now. So given the safety alone, but as a presumptive test, they've been very good.
So next question, and perhaps you could each take a kick at this one, is around one of the themes that we talked about at the beginning of the presentations, which was around making good decisions about the future with knowledge that you have limited resources and limited funding to do that. So if you were to give one piece of advice about your specific discipline around the future and how to do it in an effective way on a limited budget with limited resources, what would it be?
I'll start.
Who wants to go first?
Pick somebody.
Well, when you have limited resources, as we all do, it's best to, maybe not be the pioneer in a particular field or in a particular discipline or a particular technology. You may want to sit and wait for the first few publications to come out, the first few recommendations to see how things start to shake out. It's very expensive to do basic research. It's very expensive even to do applied validations on new technology. So I guess I would suggest to take a little bit of a defensive posture and see how things shake out. However, the 4 technologies that I mentioned in DNA, none of those are new. And they've taken a decade or so to so-called shake out now. So, there's enough data out there, there's enough information, there's enough expertise that you can very confidently choose these things to start to move forward. But as far as the latest stuff, grabbing a new technology off the shelf, that should come with much more caution.
Thanks, Tim. Who wants to take next?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to what Tim's saying, but I think probably the most beneficial thing we can do is increase the different spheres of communication and dialogues that we actually have to know what people are doing and saying. So, obviously we have the OSAT going on here in the United States, but what the academic circles are actually talking about, what research is happening, what other laboratories across the world are actually doing, obviously what papers are being published, but particularly in areas that you may not have expertise in, the more communication, the more dialogues you can have, even from people that are strongly critical, they have input that allows us to modify how we are doing things and know where we are going. The earlier you can do that, the more often you can actually do that, the better we're going to be prepared, I think, for what comes in the future. Mm-hmm. So, there are a lot of academics that are doing really good research, but you have to know about it. And some of it's very compartmentalized in certain academic circles. Some of it isn't. But knowing what all this research is and being able to talk about it, discuss it, gives you alternatives, gives you options, and then you can do, for example, what Erich is doing. He actually set up studies to implement some of these, like likelihood ratios, to add on what he was saying. I think we're going to be tasked with doing likelihood ratios in a lot more disciplines than we are. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. We're going to be improved, I think, because of that. But it's going to require a lot of studies on our part. But the more communication that we actually have, the more we know about what's going on. And this requires to get out of our fields and start talking to people.
And I guess if you're a manager in a forensic lab, you could always join the American Society of Crime Lab Directors and open up your whole network of people.
Big facilitator, yeah.
Thanks. Over to you, Erich. What are your thoughts about being cost effective in the future?
I'm the only non-manager on the panel. So I'll give you a perspective because my managers come to me looking for answers and efficiency. So one of the, we went down this venture of looking at these different instruments. They were also looking at efficiency along the way. But just because you buy an instrument doesn't mean that you're going to be more efficient or you don't need more resources. We did learn the more machines that you have in-house, or even if you have one machine, you need redundancy and data backup, all types of things that we weren't thinking about to maintain the systems. So there's that cost of maintaining the system on an annual basis that we weren't thinking about. It was a hard lesson learned. One thing I did want to point out, the pandemic kind of forced me, my management came to me and said, hey, we're going to this, I'm at home right now. So the way it works, I'm in 1 week and I'm out another week because of the pandemic. But my management wanted people to still be working when they were at home. And so I have a Surface Pro that I'm talking to you with today. And what I did is I embedded other examiners' Surface Pros with test sets, and they have essentially a beta version of the softwares from different machines on their Surface Pro. So they can continually do comparison work sitting at home. Now, they probably hate me for figuring that out, but it is doable. But like Tim said, there are some, you kind of want to let somebody else bite the bullet, learn the lessons, the hard lessons first before you decide to buy a machine. That's probably the best advice given. So that's my perspective.
Great. I didn't miss the...
Let me add one more comment, Tony, if I can.
Of course.
So Tim has heard me say this, but probably the one unifying thing in all this is invest in your IT infrastructure, is a strong opinion that I have. I mean, it's a commonality with everything that we're actually doing is the use of IT. So I think you got to prepare and plan for that, but the more you can invest in that, the better you're going to be, I think, with your instruments.
Well said. Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of our session. I wanted to say thank you very much to all three presenters and to all the individuals that have attended. I'm just going to pass it over to Mark Mogle now for closing remarks. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Tony. I have to say it's been an excellent 2 hours, just packed with information. I think all the participants will find this very useful. And to Bruce's point about communication, this is really the purpose of this event and similar events. We're trying to share our experiences and our practices amongst the international community, and hopefully make everybody better and make justice stronger in many countries around the world. Just to let everyone know, we plan to send out a link to the video as well as the slides. So if you registered, which everyone did, you should be receiving that information shortly. Thank you to all the participants, and especially the team down in Costa Rica that inspired this session today. We have a great relationship with Costa Rica, and they are always bringing us excellent ideas. So please look for similar events like this in the future. And if you get an email, I hope you sign up, register, and participate in any future events as well. With that, I will just say, stay healthy, and thank you for joining.